Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining me for this week's edition of the SMIE Consulting Midweek Roundup. It's Wednesday, June 7th, 2023, and this week we're going to be taking a look at three questions we've been hearing from international educators over the past week, particularly last week at NAFSA. And before we get to those questions, I do want to give a special shout out to those watching live on Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, or Twitter. Thank you for joining the live conversation, but also those that watch on repeat. I know we're all busy. We can't always get to these live. And I just want to say how grateful I am for those that reached out last week in person at NAFSA, people whom I've never met before, who are coming up to me and sharing how valuable they find these conversations on Wednesdays for the Midweek Roundup. And it's really heartwarming to me to know that you're out there, and I'm not just a voice in the wind here. It's good that the content is being well received, and really appreciate you taking the time to introduce yourselves and to let me know where you're connecting from and how you found out about us and what the roundup has meant for you. So thanks so much. That really gives me the motivation I need to keep doing these and making this a regular part of my weekly international edification journey. So as we do each week, we take our themes for these questions from our newsletter. So if you're already watching the Roundup, hopefully you're also getting the newsletter or subscribe to it. There are a couple different ways you can do that. I'll be dropping the links to our website, smieconsulting.org/subscribe, where you can go down, see an archive of all the past editions of the newsletter, as well as subscribe by entering your details. You can also, what you get each week, if you sign up that way through the website, an email version of it that comes to your inbox Monday mornings, 9 a.m. Eastern, and that will be your news for the week of not only international ed, but also any social media news that impacts what we do in international education and how you can leverage these stories to help you improve what you do in your work in international ed. So that comes to you in an email format if you just subscribe through the website. If you prefer international ed news through to get it through LinkedIn, we have a version of the newsletter, identical version available that you can subscribe to via LinkedIn. LinkedIn, we're just about to hit 1,100 users, 1,100 subscribers via LinkedIn, another 100 through the email version. So we're really grateful to be reaching such a wide range of individuals through the newsletter. So please do be sure to subscribe so you can see the stories that are developing on Mondays and then have an idea perhaps on what we're going to cover here on Wednesdays in question format and go a little bit deeper. Those are the hot takes on Monday, and we'll go a little bit deeper on some of those themes here on the Roundup on Wednesdays. And also, if you prefer not to see me, and that's fine, there's an audio-only podcast version available across all major podcast providers. So do take advantage of that if you have a moment and would prefer to listen rather than watch these conversations as they happen. So let's get right into our first question of the day. And this is one that is been a hot topic for a couple of years, and it was 2 years ago this summer that the United States government from the White House issued a statement, a joint statement on support for international education. And this was a declaration that involved Department of State, Department of Commerce, Department of Homeland Security, Department of Education. All were involved in various ways, shapes, and forms in pieces of this joint statement. And last year at the EdUSA Forum, there was another topic. There was a topic at the one of the sessions was what's happened since a year since that declaration, and what we'll talk about today is kind of the lingering effects of that statement last year and this year, and how we move out, what progress has taken place, and what do we see as kind of the vision for the U.S. But the question is, why is a U.S. international ed strategy needed but not happening anytime soon? I had the fortune of being interviewed for this article. There was an article in Inside Higher Ed that came out on Thursday or Friday last week, and I'll drop the link into the chat as well. What that article basically talked about is the themes of NAFSA coming back to DC, being in person again, and the article was entitled "The UN of Higher Ed Returns to a Changed World." with the subtitle, "A Mix of Optimism and Anxiety Defined This Year's NAFSA Conference 3 years after the COVID pandemic upended international higher ed." So it's a kind of a look at how the conference has changed. 6,000 last year in Denver to over 8,500 in DC. The hopes was the DC conference would attract a little bit more, up to 10,000, which was kind of the pre-pandemic norm for conferences in DC. That didn't reach that amount, and still some lingering doubts on who's coming, but maybe it's budget issues coming out of COVID. Last year we saw in Denver a lot of 40% of the attendees were first-timers that didn't really have a lot of expertise in the field, so maybe not a lot of them stuck or could afford to come again this year. But the good scene at the convention center in DC was that the return of the country pavilions in large numbers. And that certainly was a very significant hole in the conference last year, as overseas visitors that frankly weren't able to travel to get into the country, too expensive, limited flights, border restrictions, all of that. But this year they reopened. China had a strong presence. Many of the other countries from Europe that had smaller or no presence last year were back in full force. Latin America had very strong contingents from Colombia, from Mexico, other nations in the region that had a significant university presence there. We had others. Australia had a huge pavilion there. You had also the traditional folks from Korea, Japan, top sending countries, Canada, had a very significant presence as well. So there was certainly a large growth in a number of pavilions, kind of back to pre-pandemic levels, maybe a little bit under, but at least in terms of the exhibitors, the exhibit hall wasn't perhaps as full as it was the last time it was in DC in 2019, but certainly the volume of people coming was significant from overseas, and that certainly warms the heart a bit. The article itself obviously interviews Fanta, NAFSA's new executive director, past president as a university representative, but now executive director. And as I told the writer for this article that NAFSA hiring Fanta, and I've said this on social before, hiring Fanta as the executive director is the best decision that NAFSA has ever made. And her impact on the topics of the themes of the conference certainly was felt. Her work in the DEI space at American University, in addition to her being an international student herself, certainly seems to be the driving force of what NAFSA is becoming. And in the article, she certainly makes the case for the kind of the historical toll of COVID on what we're seeing at the conference and membership. But there were some frustrations from some that were at the event that there's still some areas that are being underfunded in terms of international programs and recruitment at U.S. institutions. Others voice concerns over rising geopolitical tensions, and frankly, those are always there in one way, shape, or form. It's just different stuff, different day in a lot of cases. But there are some serious big issues with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, tensions with China, and all of that, and fears that COVID has completely forever changed the landscape of international higher ed. So there's a lot of that happening. That what I see, what I had to share with the writer of the article, is that the new normal isn't going to be like it was before. There are significant changes that have happened, and certainly other commentators in the article reflected that as well. What I was asked primarily about is NAFSA kind of serving as, the article talks about this, serving as kind of the main driver for an international education strategy in this country. We've seen other nations, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, Canada to a lesser extent. They have great policies, but not necessarily a unified approach, but certainly have more things working for them than against them at this point. Probably getting too big might be one concern. But in the US, we've never had a national strategy. People had talked about that joint statement that is the focus of this article 2 years ago, kind of being the beginning steps, but it wasn't a strategy. What it did, it has empowered the federal departments, state, commerce, education, and homeland security, to do what they could to maximize the opportunities to grow study abroad, U.S. students studying abroad, but also to grow our inbound international populations. That is a great directive, but until it gets federal White House level support and direction, there are going to be certain things that would be real game changers that aren't going to happen because they're tied up in politics. They require congressional action. They require, frankly, as I mentioned in the article, some political capital being spent to make and drive this cause forward. So I've advocated for an international ed czar in the past, talking about the need for that White House level direction and coordination of efforts, because that was a challenge we saw last year at the Ed USA Forum. We saw Commerce and State and Education and Homeland Security give updates on what they've been doing individually in their own spheres of influence, as well as the fact that they have these intra-departmental meetings, so that that's happening. But the challenge is that there's only so much they can do on their own, and that's pretty much what this has been left to. It's that they've been left to their own devices to do what's possible within their own sphere of influence. And keep in mind, what we're also challenged here with a national strategy is until it has that White House level support that really moves things forward, we're lacking in coordination, we're lacking in direction, we're lacking in funding, we're lacking in regulatory change that has to happen to facilitate a more broad opening of the doors of the U.S. to the best and the brightest. That's always been what we've said we attract, that we have foreign students today, world leaders tomorrow that have come to the United States. We know that a third of all world leaders did some part of their education in the United States. So we play a role in that. And the evidence is there to back that up. But what have we been doing to enhance those opportunities? Beyond just the world leaders, but to enhance some folks are going to drive their countries forward in education, in business, in culture, in the environment, in other areas of life that are vital to their own growth as nations. So we see certainly that lack of unification and policies that, depending on the president, can change, flow, kind of wave with the wind, and whichever way that president comes in and direction can impact policy. Until there's real change regulatory means, for example, the one that most impacts what would be a game changer for me is if, and would open the doors wide, and it does require congressional action, is for F1 to be considered a dual intent category. We've seen what's happened in the UK, that the UK government considers international students and their dependents coming in as net impacts on migration numbers. They consider them migrants, even though it's a temporary visa category that they generally return home, and in large numbers they generally return home. The challenge has been, what do you do with them? Should we consider them all immigrants? In Australia, they consider many international students that are coming two-stage migrants, that they come in to study as their entry point to work opportunity, and whether those opportunities. And sometimes those students want to accelerate that transition from study to work. But that exists. Canada, same way. There's ways in Canada, UK, Australia, where students from the get-go, when they're enrolled as students, can work off campus and doesn't have to be directly related to their program, like we require in the United States for OPT or curricular OPT. It has to be done curricular practical training, not curricular OPT. That doesn't exist. But for international students in the United States, they're limited to 20 hours a week on campus, unless it's in an emergency situation. Then they have to apply for a particular permission to do that. But that opportunity for getting into the work world in country beyond their university is possible more possible in Canada, UK, Australia than it is in the United States. So policies are set up to really disincentivize businesses from hiring international students in the United States. So that's one of those nuts. But if we can crack that nut by saying that F1 students can potentially be immigrants to the United States, then they could return home. It's their choice, and we view that as a choice. We don't put expectations that they have to go home after they finish their studies, which is the default rule. The 214B, excuse me, 214B requirement, which is where most international students that get denied visas will be denied because they haven't proven that they're not going to immigrate to the United States after they're done with their study, that their plan is to emigrate to the United States, when technically they can't say that if they're applying for a non-immigrant visa category, even though legally it is possible. After graduation, they get OPT still on their F1. A company hires them while they're an F1 OPT student to become an H1B that allows them to be in the country for an initial 3 up to 6 years, and then apply for permanent residency during that 6-year period. So it is possible, even though their initial visa category does not allow them to stay. So it's a very convoluted process. Some students, particularly those who get on OPT and get with companies that want to hire them more permanently, that process can take 6 to 10 years or longer for applicants to get to that green card stage where they become permanent residents. So we don't make it easy in any stretch. We are disadvantaged in a lot of ways by that single intent, being you have to prove you're a non-immigrant in order to get your visa to come here in the first place. So that's a challenge. So that's my recommendation for one of those game changer things that has to happen before we're really going to be able to move forward and really take advantage of all the very positive things we have in the U.S. To drive our country forward on the international education front. So there's a lot in that, and I hope everybody gets a chance to read that article. I talk also about the capacity, and there's another article in Times Higher Ed from Alan Goodman, President and CEO of IIE, someone who I've known and respected working for IIE for a number of years myself, but Alan certainly has that historical perspective of why the U.S. is that driving force and can be even better, is because of our capacity. We're at 5% of our higher ed enrollments are international. In the UK, in Canada, in Australia, they're pushing 30, 35% at a lot of universities. And that politically isn't sustainable. Though funding-wise, they need those international students to fund their institutions' programs and do all the other things they need to do. Politically, there are limits, as we're seeing in the UK. Too many dependents coming with too many students to the UK in the past year on these one-year master's programs has caused the government, the current Conservative government in the UK, to react quite negatively towards that. They've now banned those dependents. And that's something that we need to address here in the United States. We don't have that particular issue, but what that tremendous increase, they were up to over 680,000 record numbers that they've had in the UK for international students. And now they're having a reaction. And that bad press from that dependent ban is going to have knock-on consequences. There's even talk of the government limiting post-study work again, which they did back in 2009. So a lot of potential damaging things happening in the UK. In Canada, they're struggling in certain provinces with capacity to keep adding new international students. In some, there's clear, in Quebec, international students are being denied visas now because there are suspected fraud for those that have come, particularly for vocational programs. Similarly, in Australia, you're seeing the same kind of thing. Australia made the mistake of giving international students unlimited work off campus, or up to 40 hours a week work off campus during the pandemic, and they're now set to reverse that as of, I think, later this month. So that will no longer be an option, and we'll see if that trend of students coming to Australia will continue. So there's a lot of challenges that go into this that government policy can impact positively, but oftentimes it's the government's reacting to perceived problems in the market because of lack of control, institutional control, government control over who's getting visas, who's coming in, who's what are they coming for, and are these the right students to be bringing in, given their potential intent longer term. So all of these things are factors that go into play. But why we're not having it anytime soon, I just don't think the political capital and will is there to be spent on this kind of an international ed strategy. With the divisive nature of our country right now, frankly, the politics of certain groups that are either far to the right or far to the left that will let anybody in or let nobody in, or very restrictive policies on the front end. There are real problems until we get more of a consensus and a more coming together of our country on these issues. Remembering that we're a country of immigrants, and that's what I always go back to. I'm an immigrant that came to the United States 49 years ago. June 1st, 1974, my family emigrated to the United States, and I was an L2, an intercompany transfer dependent. So I was an international student when I first came, as a kindergartner, albeit, but my journey is representative of what this country is all about, or can be, and the potential this country can have, and what we're allowed to be as Americans and those that choose to come here and work. That's something that we have to address. Immigration reform is top of that list. And unfortunately, the pieces that we need to get passed to have been in recent bills. And President Biden's Build Back Better bill included a provision to make F1 a dual intent category. A recent bill we featured last week in the roundup, or last week in our newsletter, also included that, called the Dignity Act. But it was one line in the bill, but it had this was thrown in with a variety of other border control and immigration pathways for dreamers and other skilled laborers that come to the United States, or unskilled laborers that come to the United States. Building those in, those are unfortunately, politically very hotly charged issues that are unlikely to pass as a whole. And our one line for F1 students to be dual intent, unfortunately, is probably going to get lost in that shuffle. Because if they can't do that, and Congress can't pass that, then there's little hope of anything concrete happening that would be a signal to the world that, hey, we're serious about growing and having an international ed strategy in our country. We need it, but is it going to happen? Not anytime soon. So long story short, there we are. Let's move on to our second question of the day. Why does meeting international student expectations matter? Really, this is a kind of a two-part question. It's really, how are you managing international student expectations in terms of sharing with students what you can actually deliver on your campus and in your communities, in your state, for jobs and all of these types of things long term. And then what are you actually delivering on? And expectations can be everything from how well they're going to adapt to classes in the United States, what their expectations before they arrive are related to who's going to be in the classroom with them, what are they going to be able to do, what their living arrangements are going to be, some are thinking, and parents are certainly thinking, particularly for undergraduates, what are the prospects for employment after I graduate? And there's a couple of articles this week. One's from intl that shares the need to manage those expectations and how do you meet them, and what does meeting those expectations mean long term in terms of your success as an institution, meeting your goals for enrollment, meeting your goals for, hopefully your goals aren't just enrollment goals, they are graduating successful alumni goals, as we talk about, and I've shared how we do it at UNLV. It's been a part of my 6 Ps of Strategic International Enrollment Management. I'm going to be talking more about that over the coming months as well. But as to meeting expectations, also, before you can do that, you really need to set those expectations. And temper those expectations in terms of reality. But part of what the importance of meeting international student expectations really means is painting that picture for what the reality is going to be like for those students when they get to your campus. And as much as possible, that needs to be bang on, here's what current students are going through, here, let them tell the stories, and then you delivering on those promises. And you would much rather under-promise and over-deliver when you're talking about expectations, right? Because we've all heard promises. I certainly heard a ton of them last week at NAFSA, meeting with prospective vendors that are service providers that wanted to work with us. They're saying, oh, we can deliver X number of students in the first year. Oh, we will be having X new partnerships that we'll be able to generate for you in the next year. And the reality is next to none of them will be able to meet those lofty expectations. And if I added up all the new students that I could be enrolling as a result of the conversations I've had last night, we'd be oversubscribed by about 1,000 students a year. But I know that's not going to happen, even if I did go with all of them. I have to have straight and hard conversations with everybody that we potentially sign with, whether it's a new overseas partner institution, whether it's a new service provider, a new agent, that, hey, what is this relationship really going to deliver on? Because that's important for me as an institution, someone who's been in international ed now for 30 years. I know I've been on both sides of this conversation as a service provider and also as an institution rep for many years at different institutions, that those conversations that you have, you never buy anything from a conversation you have at a conference. You buy it after developing relationships with the people so that you can know and trust who they are. You can see the evidence of their past work, and you can see, if it's a newer venture, you can see the promise by seeing who they're aligning with, who else is buying into this kind of a dream. So these are the things that meet those, in terms of meeting expectations. This is what you need to be doing with your students, not promising the moon and then having them come and have a bad experience and they experience nothing of what you told them or a very small part of it. You want them to come and see what you promised and more, not what you promised and only a quarter or a third of it. They need to see the value, not only from what you say, but also from, again, like I was sharing, who's currently working with you that is someone I would want to compare myself to and see myself as. That's what international students want. They want to have those conversations with current students. And when they can drive those expectations and manage them for you by presenting their actual experience, that's what's going to help you meet those needs. Because new students coming in, they don't know all the ins and outs of your campus. They don't know all the things that they're going to get to experience on your campus that they've never even thought were even possible. And only through having those current students share their stories, and then your incoming students experience that, that's where you have the true meeting of the minds, of all the coming together of all the best laid plans, and you see, wow, they had a chance to talk to our current students. They heard what the reality is for those students. They've heard what we've said about what's possible for them, and then when they get here and actually experience that and so much more, that's when you know, oh my goodness, we've done it. We've cracked the code here. We know the secret now. And when you're doing that on a regular and consistent basis by engaging your current students in those new student conversations, you're up on top. Now, this is something that will impact us all in what we do. And some years you'll be really good at it. You feel like you're having these conversations. You got the right content that you can plug into your conversations with prospective students and parents. That there's ways to bridge that gap and to make those expectations managed, but also a reality. Whatever is promised is what you can deliver on. And that's why it matters, because that's how you can build your success and build a cohort of happy graduates and successfully employed graduates, or on to the next level of their education graduates, and then using their stories to reinforce what your messaging is to your next class coming in. So that's why they matter when you can do that consistently. Final piece, that's a real quick one. You may have seen it last week. Canada, their IRCC board that sets the rules for what immigrants to Canada can do, what students in this case need to take in terms of English proficiency tests to qualify for entrance. Up until recently, IELTS was the only test that Canadian prospective international students going to Canada could take to enter into the student direct stream, and that's the kind of the fast track for study permits, which is their equivalent of student visas to Canada. IELTS had been the only one acceptable. As of last week, they have now accepted TOEFL, they've accepted PTE Academic, and a couple of other minor English proficiency tests as well as equal criteria or equal tests for students looking to get into the student direct stream to Canada and its institutions. So how does that decision by Canada's IRCC impact an international education company's value? Well, here it is. IDP is third owner of IELTS, along with the British Council and the Cambridge Group, Cambridge Education. Those three own IELTS. And because IELTS was the only test for Canada up until last week, now with a wider range of English language tests available, IDP's value on the Australian Stock Exchange dropped 15% last week, or 2 weeks ago now, as a result of this decision by IRCC to add in these other English language tests. So again, this is the perspective I talk about all the time as part of our 6 Ps of strategic international enrollment management, is having a perspective on the world. It's now easier for international students to go to Canada in terms of the English proficiency tests that they can take. So how are you demonstrating your awareness of that in your messaging in terms of English proficiency on your website, in terms of what are the many ways that students can come to your institution and document their English proficiency? Is it through tests, or is it through their curriculum in high school or college? What are the many ways that they can do that? So that's something you need to be aware of in your messaging, because these actions have consequences around the globe. And until we realize that and remember that and have that influence our decision making for what we do in our offices, how we message, even on something as minor as this, as an English proficiency test, which isn't minor, it's major. But that one decision by Canada is now impacting what the value of an international education company, one of the giants in our field, IDP. So be aware of the world around you, and hopefully this podcast, this Roundup live chat, our newsletter on Mondays keeps you in the loop on what's going on. I know we're all busy, but we do need to stay plugged in and not be 100% down, heads down. Let's get it done. Let's get it done. Keep the blinders on and get focused. You really need to keep your finger on the pulse of what's going on around the world, and hopefully we can help you get there. So thanks again for being a part of the conversation this week, and we look forward to chatting with you at an upcoming event, live or in person. We'll be back with you live next Wednesday, the 14th of June, before we head to China for 2 weeks. I'll be excited to share some of those details next week. Have a great day. Look forward to chatting soon.